Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And today in this session, we begin chapter 18. Peter Rodino and his counsel, John Doerr, had taken care to conceal their sentiments and conclusions as the impeachment process went forward. Every public statement and private maneuver was measured to create an illusion of neutrality. It was a necessary pose. They saturated the committee with a catalog of evidence of the crimes by the Nixon White House, all without comment. Their strategy was designed to create a nonpartisan majority for impeachment composed of the committee's 21 Democrats and perhaps half a dozen Republicans. Returning from the hearing room to his office for lunch on June 27th, the chairman was on edge. After 6 weeks of closed hearings, he was under intense pressure to expedite the proceedings. Republicans were charging that the majority was deliberately dragging out the hearings. The Democratic leadership, sensitive to the charge, was growing uneasy. He stopped by a small alcove office where his administrative assistant, Francis O'Brien, sat chatting with 3 reporters, Sam Donaldson of ABC Television and Paul Houston and Jack Nelson of the Los Angeles Times. The press had been exceedingly gentle with Rodino, Congressman everyman from Newark, unpretentious, fair, judicious. How did the chairman think the committee vote was shaping up? Rodino's guard was down, and he said what he thought. All 21 Democrats on the committee would vote to impeach. He hadn't taken a formal count, but he was pretty sure. The 21 votes were sufficient to take impeachment to the floor of the House, but he deemed it essential to pick up at least 5 Republicans and make a strong showing. Nelson, an experienced Washington reporter, had no reason to assume that Rodino's comments were off the record. His front-page story in the next morning's Los Angeles Times said that Rodino had told unnamed, quote, visitors in his office that he expected all 21 Democrats to vote to impeach, and it named the 6 Republicans whom Rodino thought most likely to join the majority: William S. Cohen of Maine, M. Caldwell Butler of Virginia, Hamilton Fish Jr. and Henry P. Smith of New York, and McClory and Railsback of Illinois. The Times account said Rodino had concluded that the evidence was sufficient to justify a Senate trial. It was a, quote, background story. Nelson had reported the facts without naming Rodino as a source or quoting him directly. Late the next morning, O'Brien handed the chairman a clipping of the story, and Rodino turned ashen. His offhand comments could destroy his carefully constructed image of impartiality, and with it all hope of bringing Republican votes over. At the White House, Clausen wasted no time. If the Los Angeles Times account was true, he said, Rodino should be dismissed as chairman and replaced by a fair-minded Democrat. Speaker Albert phoned Rodino, urging him to defend himself on the House floor. Rodino went to the floor and told his colleagues, "I want to state unequivocally and categorically that this statement is not true. There is no basis in fact for it, none whatsoever." In that evening's telecast, Sam Donaldson said that he had believed Rodino's estimate to be off the record, but since it had been reported and denied, he felt obliged to confirm the accuracy of Nelson's account. The next day, Clausen described the Judiciary Committee inquiry as a, quote, partisan witch hunt, and Father John McLaughlin called Rodino a quote, crude political tactician who ought to disqualify himself. And I want to make a comment. Since our last session, I checked. I before I said this, I wanted to make sure, but I confirmed it. Father John McLaughlin here is the same John McLaughlin who he was a Jesuit priest at the time. He was the same John McLaughlin who would go on in later years to host the McLaughlin Report, McLaughlin Group on PBS for many years that I watched every week, just about, for many, many years, in the 80s, 90s, maybe on into the 2000s, I guess. It went on till he passed away in 2016, I believe, and had panelists on there who would discuss the issues every week. He had his own unique style of calling on them for answers and then telling them what the right answer was and telling them when they were wrong. Jack Germond of the Baltimore Evening Sun was one of his regular panelists. Eleanor Clift, Morton Kondracki, Mort Zuckerman, Fred Barnes. Anyway, I watched it regularly. Pat Buchanan, of course. They were old friends, and going back to the Nixon White House. And so anyway, I watched that regularly, and that's the same John McLaughlin that it's referring to here. He was as I said, he had his own unique style, and it made for impressionists, especially Dana Carvey did a hilarious impression of John McLaughlin on the McLaughlin Group. So back to the book. Again, Father John McLaughlin called Rodino a, quote, crude political tactician who ought to disqualify himself. Unnerved by his blunder, Rodino found himself suddenly on the defensive. His credibility with the so-called swing votes, the committee's moderate Republicans and Southern Democrats, strained. Rodino was most concerned about one member of the minority, Thomas Railsback of Moline, Illinois. Railsback was the barometer of impeachment, Rodino believed. He could take 2 to 4 other Republicans with him. An undistinguished legislator, Railsback normally had little influence over his colleagues, but on impeachment he was genuinely conscience-stricken, and everyone knew it. If Railsback were finally to vote against the president, it could make impeachment acceptable to the JCs and Rotarians of America. The impeachment investigation had become all-consuming for Railsback. His evenings were spent discussing the evidence with fellow committee members or listening to the tapes. He had listened so often that he had pinpointed several errors in the text of the committee's transcripts. Railsback shunned the Washington social life as conducted in Georgetown parlors, and so he was surprised when Joseph Alsop, the prominent political columnist, invited him to lunch at his home. Alsop's call sounded almost like a command. Railsback reported on schedule. Alsop traveled in the sophisticated circles that Railsback rarely encountered. A confidant of Kissinger and Haig, he had come to believe the president was, quote, 99% nutty as a fruitcake, end quote. The armpit of humanity, he called Nixon. But like Kissinger and Haig, Alsop reeled at the specter of impeachment. He dreaded its effect on the political system, on Kissinger's delicate foreign policy, on the struggle in Indochina. Grievous and permanent national harm would come if a president were routed from office. All presidents stretched the law, he believed, necessarily so. It was Nixon's misfortune to be so personally unappealing that he was being held accountable for it. Impeachment, Alsop told Railsback, would be a catastrophe. It would shake the foundations of a strong presidency. It would be a triumph for the political fringes. The issue was not Richard Nixon, Alsop stressed, but the survival of American strength and tradition. Alsop mocked the prospect of Ford becoming president. The absurdity of a man elected from a single Michigan congressional district, totally without experience in foreign affairs and without any concept of executive authority, occupying the White House. Railsback was surprised at Alsop's undisguised advocacy. It seemed indecent, pompous, even outrageous. Yet he found Alsop fascinating. Alsop invited Railsback back for breakfast and then for another lunch. At their last meeting in early July, Railsback secured Alsop's assurance that the conversation would be absolutely confidential and revealed his position. He was not going to vote to impeach Richard Nixon. Alsop thought the Republic was safe. St. Clair's burden was immense. Representing his difficult client in the Supreme Court, defending him before the Judiciary Committee, coordinating each move with the White House public relations machine. In addition, Bazard had suffered a heart attack in mid-June and was recuperating at home. Bazard read through the briefs submitted to the court and was appalled at their quality. St. Clair's arguments for withholding the tapes were thin, sometimes amounting to little more than nitpicking. There was no hint of the articulate scholarship that Charles Allen Wright had brought to the first tapes case. St. Clair, who had never argued a case in the Supreme Court, had left much of the work to his even less experienced assistants. Jaworski and Lacavara, on the other hand, had paid careful attention to the preparation of their briefs and their arguments. They had decided to divide the oral argument before the court. Jaworski's presence in court would in itself underscore the momentous nature of the case. Lacavara was more familiar with the legal intricacies. They agreed to remind the court at every opportunity that they represented the government and that Richard Nixon stood before it not as president, but as an individual. They would therefore insist on sitting to the right of the bench, the side reserved for the government. Another matter of protocol presented difficulties for Jaworski. Government attorneys traditionally wear formal cutaways before the Supreme Court, but Jaworski years ago had once gone to the court in a borrowed cutaway that didn't fit. He thought he had looked like a penguin, and he wasn't going to repeat his mistake. Lacavara got out a treatise on Supreme Court practice, photocopied the section on attire, and sent it to Jaworski. He got a note back saying, "You should be pleased that I'm not going to show up in cowboy boots and buckskins." On Monday, July 8th, Jaworski wore a dark blue business suit. As the government sedan pulled up to the Supreme Court building just after 9, a cheer went up from the crowd waiting in line to get inside. "Give 'em hell, Leon, baby!" and "Go, Leon!" people shouted. Jaworski, Lacavara, and James Neal had to struggle to get through. Inside, they waited uneasily for about half an hour in the room normally used by the Solicitor General. To break the tension, they speculated about how they would argue to each of the justices in the old paintings that lined the walls. Just before 10, they took their seats at the table to the right of the bench. St. Clair was at the other table. At 2 minutes after 10, the 8 black-robed justices filed in. The jammed courtroom was silent as Chief Justice Berger announced the case. "You may begin whenever you are ready, Mr. Jaworski." Jaworski seemed nervous. He spoke awkwardly as he slowly recited the history of the grand jury's proceedings. He noted that the grand jury had named the president an unindicted co-conspirator, and then he moved haltingly to the heart of the matter. Who is the arbiter of the Constitution? "Now, the president may be right in how he reads the Constitution," Jaworski said, "but he may also be wrong. And if he is wrong, who is there to tell him so? And if there is no one, the president, of course, is free to pursue his course of erroneous interpretations. What then becomes of our constitutional form of government? This nation's constitutional form of government is in serious jeopardy if the president, any president, is to say that the Constitution means what he says it does, and that there is no one, not even the Supreme Court, to tell him otherwise." Justice Stewart had some questions on the point. Jaworski summarized the argument. "What I am saying is that if he is the sole judge, and he is in error in his interpretation, then he goes on being in error in his interpretation." "Then this court will tell him so," Justice Stewart said. "That is what this case is about, isn't it?" "Well, that is what I think the case is about, yes, sir," Jaworski readily agreed. He then challenged St. Clair's basic claim. Under the conditions of his appointment as special prosecutor, the case did not involve an internal dispute within the executive branch. Jaworski cited the assurances of Haig, Bork, and Attorney General William B. Saxby, Richardson's successor, as to his indisputable right to take the president to court on the question of executive privilege. It was up to the court, he said, to decide who was right on the merits. His standing was not at issue. In contrast to Jaworski, St. Clair was affable and relaxed as he began his presentation. He pressed his contention that the court did not have jurisdiction to settle a dispute within the executive branch. Though some powers had been delegated to the special prosecutor, the president was still the president, and the court could not alter that fact. Jaworski was subject to the president's orders and decisions like any employee of the executive branch. If the court ordered the president to surrender his tapes, they would inevitably make their way to the House Judiciary Committee. That action would involve the court, however indirectly, in an impeachment proceeding, a power the Constitution specifically reserved to Congress. St. Clair was interrupted 217 times by the justices' questions, but their skepticism did not seem to daunt him. They seemed dubious about his claim that executive privilege was absolute, and that the president, not the courts, was the ultimate arbiter of what evidence should be surrendered even in a criminal case. St. Clair insisted that the privilege was essential to protecting the president's privacy, whatever the circumstances. As an example, he cited privileged conversations the president might have about the appointment of a judge. Justice Marshall detected a flaw in that reasoning. "Don't you think it would be important if an about-to-be-appointed judge was making a deal with the president for money?" "Absolutely," St. Clair responded. But by St. Clair's reasoning, Marshall noted, The president would not be obliged to turn over a tape of such a conversation. I would think, St. Clair replied, that could not be released if it were a confidential communication. If the president did appoint such an individual, the remedy is clear. The remedy is he should be impeached. How are you going to impeach him if you don't know about it? Marshall asked. Well, if you know about it, St. Clair said, then you can state the case. If you don't know about it, you don't have it. So there you are. You're on the prongs of a dilemma, huh? No, I don't think so, St. Clair persisted. Marshall tried to explain. If you know the president is doing something wrong, you can impeach him. But the only way you can find out is this way. You can't impeach him, so you don't impeach him. You lose me someplace along there. The audience broke out into laughter. A few minutes later, Lacavara offered the rebuttal argument on behalf of the United States. He had scarcely begun when Justice White urged him to focus on the matter of executive privilege. Lacavara was delighted. He wanted to emphasize a key point Jaworski had failed to make about the relevancy of Nixon's status as an unindicted co-conspirator. This president is not in a position to claim this public privilege for the reason that a prima facie case showing can be made that these conversations were not made in pursuance of legitimate governmental processes or the lawful deliberations of the public's business. These conversations, as we showed in our 49-page appendix, and as the grand jury alleged, were in furtherance of a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruct justice. As to St. Clair's argument that the court must not be involved in a political dispute, Lacavara cited occasions when the court had decided cases with political implications, beginning with Marbury v. Madison. The court had a duty to interpret the Constitution. That's all we ask for today. That's all Judge Sirica has done. We believe he has done it correctly, and we submit that this court should fully, explicitly, and decisively, he paused, and definitively uphold Judge Sirica's decision. St. Clair did not use his 15 minutes to rebut Lacavara. He conceded that the court often decided cases with political overtones, but this case was different, he argued, in that it would affect the impeachment proceedings. The president is not above the law, nor does he contend that he is. What he does contend is that as president, the law can be applied to him in only one way, and that is by impeachment, not by naming as a co-conspirator in a grand jury indictment, not by indictment or any other way. It was just after 1 p.m. when the arguments concluded. St. Clair came out smiling. He chatted with reporters and signed autographs. I think it went very well, he said. Jaworski seemed less sanguine, but he smiled to the crowd, acknowledging its cheer. In the prosecutor's press office, James Doyle was getting reports from the other lawyers on the staff. Jaworski had not done a very good job. St. Clair had done better, but Lacavara had rebutted brilliantly. Bazart received a similar assessment from his sources. St. Clair met with Nixon for 40 minutes that afternoon. It had gone well, he told the president, very well. They had a good chance. He firmly believed it. The president was scheduled to spend the week in Washington, his first full week in the Capitol in 2 months. He had a busy schedule, meetings with cabinet officers, economic advisors, and congressional leaders, and assorted ceremonial occasions. The meetings would demonstrate that the country had a leader who was active in domestic affairs as well as leading the world. Nixon seemed to be reinvigorated by his travels and by St. Clair's assessment. A poll showed that 53% of those questioned thought media coverage of Watergate was excessive. On Tuesday afternoon, July 9th, Rodino shattered the president's show of business as usual. He released the Judiciary Committee's version of 8 tapes. There were awesome differences between what the White House had managed to transcribe and what the committee staff, using superior equipment, was able to hear on the same recordings. To Rodino, the differences demonstrated that the cover-up was still in progress, with the concurrence of Haig and of Nixon's lawyers. The staff had prepared a 131-page side-by-side comparison of the texts. Nearly 100 major discrepancies and omissions were noted. The White House editing proved to be predictable. Changes seemed tailored for St. Clair's claim that the president knew nothing of the cover-up until March 21, 1973, and then had acted to end it. According to the White House version of the meeting of March 22, 1973, the president told his aides that John Mitchell was recommending, quote, that now we use flexibility in order to get off the cover-up line. The committee transcript said that Nixon quoted Mitchell to the opposite effect, that, quote, we use flexibility in order to get on with the cover-up. Nixon's order that day to Mitchell, which Haig, St. Clair, and Bazart had tried to hide from the committee, was also there. Quote, I don't give a shit what happens. I want you all to stonewall it. Let them plead the Fifth Amendment, cover up or anything else if it'll save it, save the plan. That's the whole point, end quote. St. Clair tried to justify the omissions and discrepancies. That section had been left out because it was not deemed relevant, he told reporters. It concerned the Senate Watergate Committee and technically did not involve an obstruction of justice since it referred to a congressional, not a Justice Department, investigation. The subpoena had called for a conversation among Nixon, Dean, and Mitchell. The omitted conversation occurred after Dean had apparently left the room, and it was therefore outside the bounds of the subpoena, St. Clair said. What about the other discrepancies? The reporters asked. I would not look upon this as sinister. My experience has been that if you give these tapes to 3 people to listen to, you get 3 variations. Ziegler tried to deflect the impact of the disclosures. He called in reporters from the 2 major wire services and charged that the release was a, quote, hyped public relations campaign by Rodino, Dorr, and the Democrats. They have chosen the public relations route, which will focus the news media on only one section of the tapes. They should release the full body of evidence altogether, all at once, and not in piecemeal fashion. The headlines in the next morning's editions of the Washington Post, July 10th, read, Transcripts link Nixon to cover-up. At 10 o'clock, the President and Kissinger met in the cabinet room with the congressional leadership of both parties to brief them on the trips to the Middle East and the Soviet Union. Beginning with a long monologue, Nixon observed that his tough posture in the Middle East and with the NATO leaders in Europe have been enough reason to expect a cool reception in Russia. It did not turn out that way. Of the 3 summits, discussions we had there were the fullest and least belligerent. We made progress that would have been considered monumental 2 years ago. But now, with so much done, it doesn't seem so important, perhaps. He turned to the specifics of the nuclear weapons agreement. Senator Mansfield and Senator Robert E. Byrd, the Democratic whip, appeared to be asleep. Nixon reminisced about earlier summit meetings. In 1972, we went out to one of the dakas, and I sat for 4.5 hours with 3 Soviet leaders. I took a rough beating on Vietnam. Very rough. Brezhnev paced the floor and pounded the table. In 1973, I went to bed at 11 p.m. Henry woke me up at 12 and said, Brezhnev wants to talk. We sat up from 12 to 3:30. This time they gave me a beating on the Mideast. If we had crumbled either time, we would have made no progress overall. But we stood tough. The president glanced around. For the U.S., the choice we have is either to make an agreement that is adequate for our purposes and for theirs. Kissinger, watching intently, picked up. One interesting thing which emerged is that they calculate our weapon strength from the perspective of... Nixon interrupted. It was a tough discussion, but not one that ended in impasse. They're going back to talk to their people, and we're going back to ours. I talked to Andrei Grechko, the Soviet defense minister, and found he was not nearly so lacking in agreement. We can see that they will go balls out. Go what? Inquired Senator Stennis, who was hard of hearing. Go balls out. Balls out, the president said loudly. There were snickers. And if so, John, you'll have to vote more money for arms in your committee. Kissinger mentioned China. We calculate that by 1978 to 1980, China could be in a position to kill millions of Soviets in any exchange. The president interrupted. We believe China would accept the loss of half of their population. France. Kissinger said Pompidou was on so much medication the last year that he couldn't think straight. Kissinger was beginning to dominate the discussion. One of the biggest problems in East-West relations is excessive talk in the United States of our approaching inferiority. We had to address that question everywhere. Therefore, we have to be concerned that our debate at home does not go overboard. He continued his report country by country. Italy. Kissinger told them that the country was, quote, in very bad shape. Forgive me, but dealing with them is like talking to a group of Harvard professors. There was laughter. You just don't feel like anything will come out of it. Germany. The new leader, Helmut Schmidt, quote, doesn't suffer from this vapid sentimentality that afflicted Brandt at the end, Kissinger said. The Russian summit meeting. The key session was Sunday afternoon in the Crimea, where the president and Brezhnev exchanged intelligence estimates. If I can be excused for saying so, anyone else would have been arrested for handing out information like that. The Secretary of State did not mention Brezhnev's refusal to reach any agreement with Nixon, but still the president seemed nervous about where Kissinger's frankness might take the discussion. Nixon offered his own interpretation of Soviet-American relations. Why have the Soviets stood aside and allowed us to settle Berlin, Vietnam, and the Middle East? 1, because the United States is big, mean, and tough as hell, and they know it. 2, the obsession with peace in the USSR. 20 million people were killed in World War II. We must have the fear elements working, but also the hope element. That evening, the president entertained 10 conservative congressmen from both parties aboard his yacht. Rain drove them below decks, where Nixon offered another monologue about his trips to the Middle East and Russia. He dwelled on the crowds, especially the ones in Egypt, how friendly they had been, how they cheered on their leader, Sadat, of course, how the Egyptians were willing to act contrary to what the Russians wanted. That was a relationship to nurture the friendship with Nasser. That was a relationship to nurture the friendship with Nasser. This time he did not correct himself, and later he referred again to Nasser. And I'll just stop here to say Nasser had been the previous leader in Egypt years before. Anwar Sadat was now the president of Egypt. The congressmen glanced at each other uncomfortably. The president rambled on. The Russians were obsessed with peace. He had had to sit through a long Russian movie about the slaughter during World War II. There was beef tenderloin for dinner. The president had become something of a wine buff during his New York City days, and the Sequoia was stocked with his favorite, a 1966 Chateau Margaux, which sold for about $30 a bottle. He always asked for it when beef was served, and he had issued orders to the stewards about what to do when large groups of congressmen were aboard. His guests were to be served a rather good $6 wine. His glass was to be filled from a bottle of Chateau Margaux wrapped in a towel. And we're going to stop here. We're still in chapter 18, and we'll finish this chapter in our next session and go on to chapter 19 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thanks for watching.